Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent and merciful, I welcome you all in today's session. And today we are going to talk about a very important description and detail related to the psychodynamic issues in organizational leadership. When we talk about psychodynamic issues in organizational leadership, we are definitely concerned with the psychological frames that how things are elaborated in terms of our mental states, our emotional context. And as we all know that psychodynamic perspectives are basically talking about the mental or emotional forces developing especially in early childhood and their effects on behavior and mental status. So that's all about the psychodynamic as per its definition is concerned. So when we talk about psychodynamic approach, there are different psychiatrists and psychologists and philosophers who put their contribution towards the development of this approach. The most important thing in the psychodynamic perspective is basically the study related to the unconscious mind, okay, which we call in Urdu as la shaur. Okay, like at the same time we have shaur as well with us, and the tahto shaur as well with us, which is basically the conscious and the subconscious part of our mind. But the unconscious mind is having much hidden parts, much deeper details, which are yet to be explored by the people. And the human beings collectively. So the unconscious mind is basically influencing our judgment, feelings, and behaviors, as this definition is given by Wilson in 2002. And the unconscious mind is basically related with the primary source of the human behavior, which is definition given by the Freud, which is in 1915. So this unconscious part is very complicated, is having much deeper implications within its scope and discussion. And as this unconscious part is going to affect our feelings, motives, and decisions, and they are going to actually powerfully influence by our past experience, and they are stored in our portion of the mind which is like yet to be explored. There are so many deeper implications related with the unconscious mind. There are so many areas and avenues yet to be known about this unconscious mind, because our intuition, our instinct, there are so many aspects which are linked with the unconscious part. And conscious brain is actually working like a RAM, which is like in the computer system, we use a component which is a RAM, random access memory. That is your conscious part, and that would only carry the things which are in our present and current memory, which are like in our active state of mind. That is your conscious part. And the connection between these two, the unconscious and the conscious, is basically established through the subconscious, which is tahto shaur, we call that in Urdu. So that tahto shaur is basically the connectivity between the conscious and the unconscious, and the relationship between these three things, the conscious, unconscious, and the subconscious, is just like we have the RAM, which is the random access memory. We have the hard disk, which is carrying the whole memory, the permanent memory of the system, and the motherboard upon which all these components are attached. So the subconscious part is like a motherboard. The RAM is like conscious, and the hard disk, which is carrying all the videos and audios and the perceptions and the receptions we are having, that is all saved in that memory part, which is the hard disk of our mind. Okay, and even sometimes we are unable to estimate the storage capacity of that unconscious part of the mind, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us tremendous capacity to store and to keep the things constant with us. And there is another very interesting phenomena related with the unconscious part of the mind, that the unconscious part of the mind cannot be erased. The unconscious part of the mind cannot be undo. The unconscious part of the mind cannot be formatted. Okay, the whatever we have perceived, whatever we have received, our five gates of knowledge, the sense of touch, smell, taste, sight, whatsoever is happening in our life is all is recorded in its true form in our unconscious mind. Okay, and then with the passage of time, as per the queries, as per the requirements, we retrieve the information, we retrieve the data, we retrieve the feelings from that unconscious part into our conscious concerns. So the psychodynamic approach is basically concerned with the mental and emotional forces which are with us from the very early childhood, and which are with us in developing our personality, in developing our leadership concerns, in developing our all the aspects and thoughts and feelings of life. So To explore this psychodynamic perspective, let's listen to one of the very important discussions. And in this, basically, we're going to talk about the introduction to psychodynamic theory and therapy. Listen carefully. There are very important points we are going to raise in this particular clip.
Most people heard about Sigmund Freud, some people heard about Carl Gustav Jung, and very little people actually know the broader school of thought that their theories belong to, which is called the psychodynamic approach. Hi, my name is Alina, I'm a graduate student of clinical psychology, and today I'm very excited to give you a brief introduction into psychodynamic therapy and theory, so that hopefully you will have a better idea about how you can pull knowledge from this vast pool of theories and diverse opinions so that you can live a better and more meaningful life. Now, before we start with introducing you to the common features, core assumptions of psychodynamic therapy, I would like to clarify some terminology because this can get very, very confusing. You might have heard the terms psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, and depth psychology. Now, in most literature, those three terms are used interchangeably. Some authors also have some preferences, so you might want to check if you're reading a book what the author understands is psychodynamic or psychoanalytic or depth psychology in his or her opinion. But for me on this channel, I'm going to also be using those three terms more or less interchangeably. However, if I talk about Sigmund Freud specifically, then I will probably use the term psychoanalytic because this is the term that mostly refers to specifically his ideas. Now, I already mentioned the terms psychodynamic theory and psychodynamic therapy. When Freud started this school of thought, he was not just trying to develop a treatment for mental illness, but also a theory to understand human development, human nature, what it means to be human, how we become who we are in general. So in Freud's case, he developed a psychoanalytic theory, and based on that, he developed a treatment for mental illnesses, which he called psychoanalysis. And now after Freud, there have been many different psychodynamic theories and many different treatment models. There have been long-term psychodynamic approaches. There have been brief psychodynamic treatments. So by now, from Freud, who really favored this long-term treatment, there is now a huge diversity in the psychodynamic field. And while the psychodynamic approach is incredibly diverse, I mean, really, psychodynamic is just an umbrella term for a whole range of theories and ideas. There are some common shared characteristics of all those theories. And so first of all, I would like to share with you the common basic assumptions of the psychodynamic approach. The first one is the developmental perspective. That means the psychodynamic approach places a huge importance on early childhood experiences. They basically think that in your early childhood, you get a blueprint of how life works, how relationship works, how you're supposed to regulate yourself, and this blueprint is something that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. Even though Freud always gets displayed as someone who basically thought childhood was everything, and I mean the whole tell me about your mother has been pretty much caricaturized, but actually he was also one of those people who warned against oversimplifying development. He wrote, "The synthesis is thus not so satisfactory as the analysis. In other words, from a knowledge of the premises, we could not have foretold the nature of the result." This means we can know everything that happened in your childhood, but that doesn't mean we can predict how exactly your life is going to turn out. Now, within the psychodynamic approach, there are different people who place different emphasis on childhood. There are some who work, especially in the Freudian lineage, who place a great emphasis on childhood experiences. And then there are other theorists such as Alfred Adler, who doesn't really care that much about childhood and doesn't really think it defines you in the way that other theorists do. While a lot of theories are focused on childhood development, there are also people like Erik Erikson who developed a developmental model that really takes the whole lifespan into account. So from the day you're born till the day you die, he describes the different developmental stages you go through and the different conflicts you have to resolve. The second shared characteristic is transference. Remember the blueprint I just talked about? Transference means that templates of past relationships and ways of thinking influence current relationships and perceptions. This in turn is closely related to attachment theory, which is another very important theory that was developed within the psychodynamic approach. I'm pretty sure you heard about secure attachment style, anxious attachment style, avoidant attachment style, and that means that the way you were attached to your primary caregiver, your mom, your dad, another person that took care of you is going to influence the way you approach relationships later in life, which means that the template you develop about how relationships work and how people are there for you or not is going to influence how you assume that later on. The reason that transference is so important in the psychodynamic approach is because the therapist and your other caregiver are not the same person, which means they're not going to behave the same way. And because you will find out as a patient in therapy that your therapist acts very different to your caregiver, you suddenly have the opportunity to learn a new template, to develop a new template that is going to be much more adaptive. The third and probably most well-known common feature is unconsciousness. There are factors outside of the individual's awareness that play an important role in explaining the development and maintenance of psychopathology. Discovering and dealing with the unconscious used to be quite the unique selling point of psychodynamic theory, but now it's pretty much everywhere. It has been discovered in neuroscience, in social psychology, in cognitive science. So the unconsciousness has been accepted into the broader scientific and cultural field. The thing with unconscious motivation is that people assume that it's your consciousness against your unconsciousness, but that is not true. Almost all the conflicts that you experience actually take place in your unconsciousness, but this is going to be something we're going to talk about in a different video. Next up in the common features is the person-oriented perspective. In the psychodynamic approach, the focus is on understanding the whole person, including strengths and vulnerabilities. Now you can see that especially in psychoanalysis, which really focus on the whole person and tries to take the whole personality into account and change the whole personality and not just focus on the one presenting problem that the patient comes to therapy with. Still, also shorter psychodynamic approaches tend to focus a bit more on the problem, but they also want to find out how the problem actually serves the person. Because in a psychodynamic approach, it is not assumed that a depression is just something to get rid of, that a depression is just a problem, but it's also something that serves you in one way or another. So before they try to get rid of the depression, they try to treat the depression, they want to understand why it's there in the first place. And in order to understand that, you have to take the developmental perspective into account, you have to take into account unconscious motivation, and with that you try to understand the person as a whole and why this particular problem presents. In a way that is good because it doesn't reduce the person down to its problem. On the other hand, it can also be bad because sometimes it leads to treatments that are way too long and could be much more focused and efficient. The fifth common feature is recognition of complexity. Going to therapy is not a linear approach. It is not always, you do not always get better and better and better. There are also times where you regress, which means that you get worse. And there are times when you progress, which means that you get better. A lot of different developments can happen in the same therapy. They affect one another, they interact with one another. So it's not a straightforward process, it's very complex. The last common feature shared among different psychodynamic approaches is the continuity between normal and abnormal. It is not one or the other. You're always moving on a spectrum. Especially the psychodynamic approach recognizes how vulnerable humans are to developing mental illness because there are so many developmental tasks, there are so many factors influencing us that it's very hard to survive this life without ever venturing from mental health into mental illness. Now, beside these common assumptions, there are also some very specific treatment features that set the psychodynamic approach apart from, let's say, the cognitive behavioral approach, or the systemic approach, or the humanistic approach, you name it. Some of these features are really incredibly specific to the psychodynamic approach, and for some others, it's just that a psychodynamic therapist would pay more attention or put a greater focus on these features, but they are also present in other approaches. Number one is the greater focus on emotions instead of thoughts. Now, especially in cognitive behavioral therapy, there is a great emphasis on thoughts. And in the psychodynamic and also in other approaches, there is a much greater emphasis on emotions. That means in a psychodynamic therapy, you might, to much greater detail, work with difficult emotions such as aggression, anger, sadness, and not just with the thoughts surrounding them. The second specific treatment feature is called exploring the defenses. Maybe you already heard of defense mechanisms, which is everything that we apply in order to not be confronted with things we don't want to be confronted with. So that means in psychodynamic therapy, a therapist will always pay special attention to how a patient is avoiding certain topics or emotions. The third specific feature is what patterns come back. This is something a psychodynamic therapist is going to pay great attention to. What are the parallels between how you grew up and how you behave now? The fourth specific treatment feature might be very obvious, but it is a great focus on the past. It can happen that in a psychodynamic therapy you will be encouraged to explore your childhood, see how you related to your parents when you were young, if there were any defining events that happened and shaped you into the person who you become today. On the other hand, it is not that if you go to a psychodynamic therapist, they will have you talk about your childhood ad infinitum without any reason. Probably they will start exploring the problem that you came with to therapy, and then they're going to see if there are any connections to earlier experiences. So don't be scared, you will not have to talk about your mom and your dad all the time. The fifth important feature is the focus on interpersonal relationships. Hello, transference. Here we go again. It is very important to see how you relate to people, and not just how you relate to other people, but also how you relate to the therapist. The sixth point, for some people it's the most interesting one, for other people it's the most weird one, for other people it's the most woo-woo one, and that is exploring wishes, dreams, and fantasies. This is where dream interpretation, which Freud and also Jung have written a great deal about, comes into play. And again, this can be a source about what is going on in your consciousness, what you might be suppressing, but it is not that in psychodynamic therapy, your therapist will ask you every time to tell them about your dreams. Now, I hope this gave you some information about what psychodynamic therapy and what psychodynamic theory is, and I'm very, very excited to explore every of these points in more detail. So if you don't want to miss it, feel free to subscribe. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.
Okay, we have just gone through the detail of psychodynamics and how different psychiatrists and psychologists have tried to elaborate this concept. And definitely it was a very detailed clip in which we have seen a couple of things, and particularly the leader is going to act like that psychologist who is going to deal with us psychodynamically, and we also need to understand that how the leaders is going to develop their own psychological frameworks. The next topic we are going to start is talking about emotional intelligence and the vicissitudes of leadership. When we talk about emotional intelligence, definitely we are concerned with self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skill. These are the 5 major dimensions of the emotional intelligence. And when we talk about vicissitudes, vicissitude would technically mean the quality or the state of being changeable. Okay, so we have to see that in the development of the leadership perspectives, what are the aspects which are actually triggering the development of the leader? What are the changeable factors, the changeable states of mind, the changeable qualities of the leader, and along with that, those changes, we have to see that what are the emotional intelligence perspectives associated with the leadership concerns. So when we talk about leadership concerns, basically it is human behavior and the relationships we are going to have with our followers, with the people we are surrounded with, our stakeholders, our 360-degree perspectives of life. And in that particular development, we have to see that what are the group processes we are involved in. As you all may know, that group processes are basically starting from the storming, norming, performing, adjourning. So we have to see that how the groups are developed, how the groups are formed, how the groups are evolving, and how their dynamics are actually operational. The second thing we need to look at is basically the leader needs to calm the anxieties and promote the hope among the followers, because everybody would be coming up with their own set of needs, everybody would be coming up with their own set of thoughts and feelings and emotions. तो एक लीडर का मेन कंसर्न ये है कि वो लोगों की एंजाइटीज को, फ्रस्ट्रेशंस को, उनके बर्नआउट्स को वो काम डाउन करे, वो कूल डाउन करे, और उनके दरमियान होप को प्रमोट करे, ताकि वो लोग ज्यादा इंटेलिजेंटली, ज्यादा कंस्ट्रक्टिवली अपना कंट्रीब्यूशन वो दे सकें. The third thing, when we talk about the vicissitudes of the leadership and the emotional intelligence, is basically dealing with the understanding personal needs and social demands. जैसे हमने एक theory context में discussion की थी related to the THA, total human approach, which said that when you hire the person, you not only hire the person psychologically or physiologically, but you hire the person socially as well. तो अब एक शख्स के साथ वाबस्ता उसकी social needs क्या हैं, उसकी psychological, physiological needs क्या हैं, उसकी safety, security needs क्या हैं, उसके social concerns क्या हैं, उसकी self esteem, self actualization के concerns क्या हैं. तो एक leader को बड़े broader perspective में अपने followers के साथ deal वो करना पड़ेगा, और उसको उन तमाम एस्पेक्ट्स को भी ज़हन में रखना है जहां जहां पर जिस जिस तब्दीली की जरूरत वो मौजूद है. And the fourth concern in this regard is basically focusing upon the positive actions, the positive thoughts, the positive concerns which the leader is going to have with his or her followers. And through those positivities, the leader would be better able to come up with creativity, with innovation, and obviously with better decision making. Now, the vicissitudes, as I discussed with you, is basically related with the life aspects, the ups and downs, the conditions and constraints of one's concern. तो अब उस बारे में जब हम बात करते हैं साइकोडायनामिक पैराडिम की, तो द साइकोडायनामिक पैराडिम इज बेसिकली talking about organizational dynamics, that how organizations are actually developing and how organizations are actually executing their concerns, how they are operational, how they are interactive, how the workflow is taking place, how the organizations are moving towards their mission and vision, how the strategy is being implemented, how the objectives are being achieved. So all these things would be becoming part of the organizational psychodynamic paradigm. And particularly when we talk about psychodynamic paradigm or we talk about clinical paradigm, it would technically mean that there is a rationale behind every human act, even those that are apparently irrational. Okay, so हर चीज के बैकएंड के ऊपर हमारे पास कोई रीजन है, हमारे पास कोई लॉजिक है, हमारे पास कोई एक्सप्लेनेशन है. कोई भी फिनोमेना, कोई भी इंस्टेंस जो है वो बिला किसी वजह के, बिला किसी ओरिजिन के वो नहीं हो गया. So we have to see the reasons, the logics, we have to see the developmental perspectives, we have to see the rationality behind everything which is taking place. अब इसी कंसर्न में we also need to look at the system psychodynamic approach, that how the systems are developed. उसमें obviously systems approach, systems thinking, systems concerns जो हैं वो हमारे establish हो जाएंगे. We also need to look at कि जो leadership theory है basically वो कैसे establish हुई, वो कैसे develop हुई, और उस leadership theory के अंदर भी वो कौन-कौन सी phases थी, वो कौन-कौन से phenomena थे which were actually kept under discussion. Likewise, जब हम psychodynamic paradigms की बात करते हैं, तो we are also supposed to look at the realistic versus idealistic approach. We need to look at कि दरअसल क्या situation है और idealistically हम उसे कैसे foresee कर रहे हैं. और इन दोनों के दरमियान, इस realistic और idealistic के दरमियान जो differences हैं, उन differences के बारे में आपकी प्लानिंग क्या है, आप कैसे उन्हें एलिमिनेट कर सकते हो, आप कैसे उन्हें एरेडिकेट कर सकते हो, और ऑब्वियसली आपको रियलिज्म में रहना है आइडियलिज्म को मद्देनजर रखते हुए. सो वी हैव टू सी कि लीडरशिप पर्सपेक्टिव में जब एक लीडर एक फॉलोअर के साथ एसोसिएटेड है और फॉलोअर उसको एक आइडियलिस्टिक कंसर्न में सोच रहा है, तो लीडर को रियलिस्टिकली उसके आइडियलिज्म को मीटअप वो कैसे करना है. इसी तरह जब हम साइकोडायनामिक कॉन्सेप्ट्स में एक स्टेप आगे और चलें, तो द ऑथर इज टॉकिंग अबाउट द इनर वर्ल्ड ऑफ लीडर्स. And when you talk about the inner world of the leaders, there is very interesting concept which is basically advocated by the author, and he's talking about the within of the person, जिसको spirituality at the workplace के साथ भी हम associate कर सकते हैं. हम एक इंसान के जो inner self के concepts हैं उनके साथ associate कर सकते हैं. So the within would actually mean in our discussion which is your inner world. Okay, हमारे अंदर मन की दुनिया वो क्या है, हमारे अपने जज्बात क्या हैं, हमारे अपने ताल्लुकात, मामूलात, एहसासात, महसूसात वो सब क्या हैं. और उसी कंसर्न में हमें रियलिटी ऑफ द ग्रुप डायनामिक्स को भी समझना है कि एक ग्रुप आपस में जब इंटरेक्ट कर रहा है, अगर हम एक ग्रुप को एक इंडिविजुअल के तौर पर भी लें, तो उस ग्रुप की जो सोशल साइकोलॉजी है हमें उन कंसर्न्स को देखना है और हमें यह देखना है कि कलेक्टिव थॉट वो कैसे एस्टैब्लिश कर रही है. इसी साइकोडायनामिक पर्सपेक्टिव्स में जब हम इनर वर्ल्ड की इन्वेस्टिगेशन करते हैं, तो देयर आर सो मेनी अदर फील्ड्स एंड कंसर्न्स व्हिच आर कमिंग अप. For example, we need to talk about developmental psychology, we need to talk about anthropology, जिसमें कि हम cross cultural comparisons की बात करेंगे. We need to talk about neuropsychology, we need to talk about psychotherapy. There are certain psychological concerns which are associated with our discussion. वहाँ पे leadership coaching involved है, वहाँ पर social psychology involved है, वहाँ पर political science involved है. So there are so many fields जो कि मिलजुल कर हमें इस बात का evidence provide करती हैं कि how to investigate the inner world. अब जब हम इनर वर्ल्ड को इन्वेस्टिगेट कर रहे हैं, तो देयर इज अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चन दैट वी नीड टू एड्रेस, जो कि इस सारे के सारे आर्टिकल का शायद खुलासा है. और साइकोडायनामिक कॉन्सेप्ट्स में हमें इस बात को बड़ा क्लियरली अंडरस्टैंड करना है कि व्हाई पीपल बिहेव द वे दे डू. कि कोई भी शख्स जिस भी बर्ताव में है, वो उसका बर्ताव एक दिन की पैदावार नहीं है. वो उसका बर्ताव लम्हाती नहीं है, उसके बैकएंड के ऊपर उसकी एक पूरी साइकोलॉजिकल डेवलपमेंट है, उसके बैकएंड के ऊपर पूरे साइकोलॉजिकल पर्सपेक्टिव्स हैं, साइकोडायनामिक पर्सपेक्टिव्स हैं। कोई भी शख्स किसी भी एटीट्यूड के साथ जब हमारे सामने डेमोन्स्ट्रेट होता है तो हमें यह देखना पड़ेगा कि वो ऐसा रिएक्ट क्यों कर रहा है, उसके प्रोएक्टिव एटीट्यूड्स क्या हैं, उसके रिएक्टिव एटीट्यूड्स क्या हैं। हमें यह देखना पड़ेगा कि उसकी साइकोलॉजिकल डेवलपमेंट्स क्या हैं, उसकी यूनिटी ऑफ थॉट में क्या है। और ये सब जान लेने से एक लीडर भी इस काबिल हो पाएगा कि वो अपने फॉलोअर्स को बेटर अंडरस्टैंड कर सके। देयर इज नो डाउट कि फॉलोअर्स को भी लीडर पर्सपेक्टिव में ये चीजें सोचनी है, लेकिन मेजरली दिस इज द रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी ऑफ द लीडर टू हैव द कैपेबिलिटी टू अंडरस्टैंड कि उसके जो फॉलोअर्स हैं उनकी जरूरियात, उनके इमोशंस, उनकी वांट्स, उनके साइकोलॉजिकल पैटर्न्स वो सब क्या हैं और क्यों हैं, सो दैट वो उनको प्रॉपरली रिस्पॉन्ड कर सके। क्योंकि अगर एक लीडर अपने फॉलोअर्स की जरूरियात को समझ नहीं पाएगा तो ऑब्वियसली वो उनके साथ एक क्रेडिबल रिलेशनशिप, वो उनके साथ एक ऑथेंटिक रिलेशनशिप, वो उनके साथ एक एथिकल रिलेशनशिप, वो उनके साथ एक ट्रांसफॉर्मेशनल रिलेशनशिप वो कायम नहीं कर सकेगा। ट्रस्ट का जो एलिमेंट है वो वहां पर इन्वॉल्व नहीं हो सकेगा। देयरफॉर ट्रस्ट को भी लाने के लिए दोनों पार्टीज के दरमियान इस बात की जरूरत है, इस बात को समझना उनको चाहिए कि व्हाई द अदर पर्सन बिहेविंग द वे दे आर बिहेविंग। ओके, और जब तक हम इस बात को अंडरस्टैंड नहीं करेंगे कि वी नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड देन टू बी अंडरस्टूड। ओके, मैं फिर से इस बात को रिपीट कर रहा हूं, वी नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड देन वी नीड टू बी अंडरस्टूड। लेकिन अगर हम पहले अपनी बात को मनवाने पर आ जाएंगे बगैर अगले शख्स के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू को समझने के, तो उस सूरत में डेफिनेटली देयर वुड बी कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स, देयर वुड बी डिसफंक्शनल एनवायरनमेंट, और उसमें हमारी जो एफिशिएंसी है, हमारी जो प्रोडक्टिविटी है, इट वुड गो डाउन। तो इस साइकोडायनामिक डिस्कशन में इनर वर्ल्ड की जो जरूरत और अहमियत है और उस इनर डेवलपमेंट को जो समझने की जरूरत और अहमियत है, दैट इज इनएविटेबल। अब इसके कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हम अपनी डिस्कशन को एक स्टेप आगे और बढ़ाते हैं। जब हम साइकोडायनामिक कॉन्सेप्ट्स को इन्वेस्टिगेट कर रहे हैं तो हमने ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल पर्सपेक्टिव में भी एंथ्रोपोमॉर्फाइजेशन का कॉन्सेप्ट देखा, जिसमें कि हमने पूरी की पूरी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को एक ह्यूमन फॉर्म में वो कन्वर्ट किया, एंड वी ट्राई टू अंडरस्टैंड द होल साइकोलॉजिकल फ्रेम ऑफ द होल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इन द टर्म्स ऑफ सोशल साइकोलॉजिकल एसोसिएशंस। ओके, इसी तरह वी हैव टू सी कि कॉग्निटिव एंड अफेक्टिव डिस्टॉर्शंस इन ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल मेंबर्स वो अकर कर सकती हैं लीडर एंड फॉलोअर्स के दरमियान भी। अब जब हम कॉग्निटिव की बात कर रहे हैं तो नो डाउट वी टॉकिंग अबाउट द बिलीफ सेट्स, एंड जब हम अफेक्टिव की बात कर रहे हैं तो वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट द इमोशंस एंड द फीलिंग्स। और बाज़ औक़ात इन इमोशंस एंड फीलिंग्स एंड कॉग्निटिव कंसर्न्स के दरमियान जब इन इफेक्टिवनेस होगी, जब कॉन्ग्रुएंस नहीं होगा, जब एक दूसरे के इन अकॉर्डेंस नहीं होंगे, तो लीडर एंड फॉलोअर के जो रिलेशनशिप है उसके ऊपर हमारे सर्टेन कंप्रोमाइजेस वो होने शुरू हो जाएंगे। तो उन कंप्रोमाइजेस से बचने के लिए भी हमारे लिए जरूरी है कि हम साइकोडायनामिक पर्सपेक्टिव्स के साथ अपनी अंडरस्टैंडिंग को वो डेवलप करें। As I was discussing with you कि there is clinical psychodynamic paradigm, और clinical psychodynamic paradigm को जैसे अभी आपको मैंने बताया कि हम define करते हैं that it argues that there is a rationale behind every human act, even those that are apparently irrational. तो बज़ाहिर हमें कोई बात बहुत मामूली नजर आती है, बज़ाहिर हमें कोई बात बहुत सतही सी नजर आती है, लेकिन वो सतही सी जो बात है, it can act like a iceberg. The iceberg is basically the tip of the iceberg is very small, but under the waves that iceberg can be like a big mountain. तो बहुत सी ऐसे पर्सपेक्टिव्स, बहुत सी ऐसी बातें, बहुत सी ऐसी सोचें जो हमारे एक दूसरे के मामलात के दरमियान, एक दूसरे के ताल्लुकात के दरमियान बहुत मामूली सी शायद कोई बात लगती है, लेकिन समटाइम्स उसके पीछे जो रैशनैलिटी है, उसके पीछे जो बैकग्राउंड है, उसके पीछे जो डिटेल है, दैट इज मच बिगर, दैट इज मच डीपर। Therefore, हमें इस सारी स्टडी से साइकोडायनामिक पर्सपेक्टिव में हमें अनकॉन्शियस माइंड प्रोसेसेस को अंडरस्टैंड करने की जरूरत है, बिकॉज कॉन्शियस माइंड, कॉन्शियस डेमोन्स्ट्रेशन तो वो है जो हमें नजर आ रही है, जो हम डायरेक्टली परसीव और रिसीव कर सकते हैं, लेकिन उन तमाम कॉन्शियस लेवल एक्टिविटीज के बैकएंड के ऊपर जो अनकॉन्शियस माइंड प्रोसेसेस हैं उनके बारे में भी इन्वेस्टिगेट करना, उनको भी सोचना, उनको भी एस्टिमेट करना, वो हमारे लिए यकीनन जरूरी है। देयर इज नो डाउट कि दिलों के भेद सिर्फ अल्लाह सुब्हानहू व तआला जान सकते हैं, लेकिन स्टिल द ह्यूमन माइंड, द ह्यूमन प्रोसेसेस, द ह्यूमन एल्गोरिदम्स, द ह्यूमन कैलकुलेशंस कैन एस्टैब्लिश सम लेवल ऑफ estimate about what can be the causes, what may be the causes with which some other person is thinking in a particular way. So those unconscious mind processes, they need to be investigated. Now, there are basically four schools of psychotherapy, and the four schools of psychotherapy are psychodynamic. There is cognitive behavioral theory, and then there is humanistic approach, and then there is systemic approach. So these are the four approaches which are basically known as the four schools of psychotherapy. Or in four schools of psychotherapy को cover करने के लिए, I would request you to please join the next Zoom meeting so that we can start up with this discussion, that how these four schools are actually correlated with one another, and how the psychodynamic is in association with cognitive behavioral model, and how that is associated with humanistic approach, and how that humanistic approach is associated with systemic approach. So for that, I have to play a very important lecture for you. I would request you to please join the next Zoom session. Thank you.